Good morning. We are reviewing and learning the conclusion of Ayin Beis, the last 130 pages. We are on page 1381, I believe. Yeah, top of 1381. Excuse me. And discussing a very fascinating section about the process of how seichel works, actually, how intelligence works, how consciousness develops. And the context is this. Mikra, Mishnah, Talmud are three dimensions of Torah, lack of a better word. And the purpose of Torah in this context is to interface and provide us, the human being on earth, a snapshot, if you wish, of God's mind, of God's plans, of God's rotzen, the rotzen chachmasa v'ritzein shel Kadosh Baruch Hu, the wisdom and the intelligence and the will of God. So when we look into Torah and we study it, number one is God is revealing to us what He wants, what mitzvahs He wants us to do. But He doesn't just reveal it as in facts and statements, He also reveals a whole methodology and intelligence. We learn Torah. We don't just read Torah. It's not just reading, like reading the Havdil, a cookbook of recipes. It has a whole process within it, how we learn it. Even Mikra, which is not the primary place of limud Torah, but still is an element of limud learning Mikra too, psukim, written Torah. In the Mishnah, it's developed into a full, called constitutional, a full body of laws that we can follow. And in Talmud, there we clarify all the questions and all the uncertainties and all the things that are not clear in the Mishnah. So these three, as we've been learning, are all part of the process of how we integrate into our minds and to our beings and into our lives what God wants of us. So essentially, if a person begins their lives and they follow Torah, Torah will align them with the plan, with the divine plan. Again, lahavdil, but no different than when you follow the operator's manual for any piece of engineering, any appliance, any machine. What you're doing is making sure the machine follows and is aligned with the engineer's plans. And you do what needs to be done to make it work well and efficiently in a healthy way. And you avoid things that will be destructive or will harm it and not allow it to function. So very much so similar is our lives. Our lives are the machine that God created. This whole world of nature is a world as a machine. A complex machine, but a very detailed design. And there are things that make this machine work in a healthy way, things that are destructive. Following Torah helps us actualize ourselves and align ourselves to the highest purpose, the divine purpose within existence. But it's not easy to arrive at because we live in a world of hell and vehesta, as we've been learning. There's concealments. If it was all very clear, like in Atzilus it's a seamless flow. Atzilus is Velikus. There's Eidos and Kalim. There's a structure of Chochma, Bina, Das, Chesed, Gvura, Teferes, Netzach, Yesod, Malchus. But these are all divine attributes, aligned with the divine purpose. It's in the world of Bria, and further, Yitzira, and then Asiya, and ultimately in this world, what the Alter Rebbe coins this world, the Medrash calls it Tachtenim. Tachten shein tacht lematim imenu. In chapter 36 in Tanya, in this world, where the divine is concealed to the point, not only is it concealed, but you have forces that are antithetical to godliness, that dominate. Like he says, cheshach kafla mechupel, a quadruple darkness, mole klippas v'sitra achre, filled with husks and coverings. And the other side, to the point of Rishoyim gevrim by, that the wicked dominate. and other such expressions. So it's a challenge. Like he said earlier, we live in a world of deception. He brought from love and armumius. So not only don't we have the clarity of Torah in an obvious way, we actually have forces that are conceal that and oppose it. So that's why we have the process of receiving Torah, but learning Torah to try to achieve the clarity necessary to pierce that darkness, to know what we're supposed to do and not do in this world. That's a summation in very simple, balbatisha, practical language of what Torah is. And Mikra, Mishnah, Talmud are three levels, where Mikra being the most divine in its revelation, but on the other hand, the least understood, meaning the least explained. You get narrative form, an asiya. You're told what mitzvahs, but there are no details and no explanations. Mishnah is less of a gilui of Elikuz, but it's more explained and broken down into midas, the shisha starim, as we learned, the 6 midas of his galus that reveal the details in a broken down way, what the Mishnah does. So we have all the halachas, and we can follow them. But that is still a state of tremendous gilui, because, like we learned, the Torah Shebiksav is informing Torah Shebapeh. Chochma law is illuminating Chochma Tata. Ish mipi ish. Then comes Talmud, and of course, with that begins a whole new era, which is where that clarity and mission is not there entirely. Nismayat Halavovis, as he said, Nismayat Hameichin, the different expressions he used, Makshakim Heshivani, we're now in a state of darkness, in a state of that is antithetical to life. Like he said, Kimese Elam. And here comes Talmud, and the sages of Talmud, and even in such a dark place, they're able to draw through their exertion and their effort, reach to a place where they can illuminate even this darkness. So initially, he said, Al pi poshet, that's the mila of Gemara, because it clarifies for those that things are not clear. But then he says, that's more than that. It's not just that it clarifies it, it reaches deeper. In order to pierce that darkness, you have to go deeper into the etzem hachachma, the words he uses, that koyach zeh, sheyibachachme hatalmud levader ulelavin kol dini hatera. This power that the sages, the Talmudic sages, have to clarify and to crystallize all the dini hatera in the Mishnah, and to draw out from it, extract from it the Eira Emes, which is higher than the Gila Eira Chachma in the Mishnah itself. So here things get turned, that by having to exert themselves because of the darkness, they reach deeper into the core Chachma. So what's happening here? This Torah that Hashem gave us in the written Torah, and the Torah Shabbat and the Mishnah Ish Mipi Ish passed on from the time of Moshe from Hashem. There's still, as much as that is revealed, there's still dimensions, of course, since it's connected to God, that are even deeper than whatever has been revealed. That depth is only reached when you have darkness, when you have to contend with a challenge. Things are not clear, so you have to dig deeper. And by digging deeper, we reach into the Etzem HaChochma, what he calls either the Ayin of Keser or the scholars of Chochma and Mokra Chochma, and the source of Chochma within Keser. And I explained yesterday the distinction. I'll elaborate shortly more about that. But what do you see here? That Talmud, though, initially is coming in order to deal with the darkness. And had we not had that, like he said before about Chet Sadas, we would not need Teresh Shabbat. Everything would be clear from Teresh Biksav. He said that explicitly in the Shalos, from the Shalah. He says, but once you are going into that darker state, it's like we talk about the neshama coming down to this world, even though the neshama above is in a higher state, but down below, you read the Tzedek Aliyah because it has to now dig deeper and find deeper resources to transform the darkness, to illuminate the darkness and then transform it. So that in turn reaches into what he's calling here Etzem HaChochma, which is higher than the Gili of Chochma in Mishnah. It seems he doesn't say it explicitly, Osa Mikra, but we'll get back to that when he discusses it. So I don't want to come to any conclusion with that. So So let me just to clarify, because it can be a little confusing. Earlier we learned that mikra, I even used the word etzem, that mikra reflects the most divine aspect of Torah. Now we're saying Talmud reaches even deeper through the Helam. So the way I would distinguish, and I think I explained it when we learned it the first time, there's two things that we have to always keep in mind when we're making a dira b'tachtenim, when we're integrating the elokus, godliness, and into our existence. One is the word called etzem. The other is the word called giluyim. And I'll explain. Etzem is, for example, just to use a human example, when a parent loves a child loves a parent, they call it etzem. Etzem koyach ha'ava. There's a atzmis, there's a ava atzmis. It's not produced, it's not acquired, it's not trained. By the mere fact that you gave birth to a child, there's a biological connection, there's an atzmis dikalov. Now that atzmis dikalov could remain concealed. It can be dormant, it can be not expressed. Then there's love as it's expressed. You'll often hear that I love you, but it hasn't been expressed enough. Now, what's expression? Expression means you actually you demonstrate that love. It can be through a hug, it can be through a kiss, it can be through conversation, it can be through actions. In Torah, in general, when we talk the same thing with the neshama and Hashem, there's an asmizdik connection. In Tanya, it talks about the ava mesuteres, the mere fact that we have a core connection to God. But that can be mesuteres. It's concealed. It can be concealed throughout our entire life. There in Tanya, chapter 18, 19, he talks about when we're challenged, it comes out. But generally, it can be concealed. But earlier in Tanya, he talks about producing a love, giving birth to love through contemplation. And both are necessary, because you don't want to just have the etzem, you want the etzem begili. So right now we can say Hashem is here in this world. Eined Mavadi, God is always here. There's always an atzmizdik connection between a neshama and Hashem, but that's not the kavanah. The kavanah is that it should be revealed, should be expressed. So when we say a Jew at heart, yes, at the core being, the pilot flame is always alive, no matter what. But the whole purpose of Torah and mitzvahs is to fan those flames and make it part of our conscious existence. Not just that it's lying in there asleep, dormant. So basically, in the language of Chassidus, the kavanah is to bring the etzem begilui. So we say yafa shah achas b'tshuva ma'asim tevim be'elam hazeh mikol chai elam haba. More precious 1 hour of tshuva and ma'asim tevim in this world than the entire world to come. The entire world to come, more than Gan Eden, Hatachten Gan Eden, Elam Haba. Why? Because the kavanah is to transform Elam Hazeh. However, if you took Giluyim, the Mishnah continues, Yafa Shah Achas Shal Kedas Ruach. If you talk about Nachas Ruach Nivra, the pleasure that we have, meaning tangible, in Giluyim, 1 hour of pleasure in Elam Haba is more than all the pleasures of this world. Not a contradiction. The first is talking about the etzem, the nachas ruach of the Eibishter, what we call nachas ruach beira, the nachas ruach of the Creator. That's the kavanah of dira b'tachtenim nesava kadosh baruch hu, this world. If you're talking about giluyim, what we benefit from, what we feel consciously, it's Elam Haba, is more begili. And the kavanah is to bring them both together. When Mashiach comes, the ultimate Elam Haba, and Tchias HaMesim will have the etzem begili. There's a lot that more can be elaborated on this, but I just wanted to point this out because now bringing this back to Torah, so mikra, you have more gilui, not gilui as an explanation, but it's more the atzmiz of the oil. So mikra, therefore, like he said before, we sense alakus in it. In Mishnah, you have more gilui, but more in seichel. Not such atzmizdika gili. When you're talking about Talmud, it's etzem, it's connecting to the etzem that's beyond gili. That's why it comes through concealment. In mikra, it's not through concealment. In mikra, simply because it's such an intense divine manifestation, that's why it only expresses itself in a story form, like we learned earlier, in a mitzvah, in an action, without details, without explanation, without reasons. But it still manifests in some way Talmud is a result actually of concealment, not of revelation. And that concealment reaches back into the etzem that's higher than Gilui. So that ultimately we want to have the joining of Mikra, Mishnah, and Talmud. We want to have the clarity that the Tanoim had. But we don't have that today, or in the time of Talmud, and definitely not today. So today it has to come through exertion. That exertion reaches back into the etzem. Ultimately, we want to have a seamless flow from Mikra, Mishnah, Talmud. So even though the Chet Tzadas was the cause for the concealment, but afterwards the Aveda that we do after the Chet Tzadas and throughout the generations till Mashiach comes, when Mashiach comes, we'll have both milas, mila of Gilui and the mila of Etzem. Etzem is reached more through the efforts, mamata l'mayla, like he's saying here, through exertion, through the concealment. So ultimately, they all come together. This, he doesn't say this explicitly in these pages here, but it's basically implied. And especially when we learn later, you'll see how it all comes together. Again, Ayin Beis is not concluded. The Rebbe Rashab didn't conclude it. But when you combine everything together, this is what this will be the picture. So ultimately, it's about bringing the reaching this atzmi all the way, like he calls here, the etzem chochma. Now, in context of what we're learning here, he's actually discussing now this process. What is the difference between understanding something initially with clarity, like Mishnah, and what happens when a person does not have that clarity, but through exertion, through effort, through deliberation, like we've been learning, through the bina, the in-depth exploration and comprehension of the idea, you reach deeper into the etzem. So in order to understand this, we need to get into understanding the dynamics of how consciousness and supraconsciousness connect with each other. I always use the word supraconscious, not unconscious or subconscious, because it's more fitting. Remember, it's not subconscious, sounds like under the conscious, like subterranean, like a cellar, like a basement. Supraconscious precedes consciousness. So the way Chassidus and Kabbalah, Chassidus explain it, is that there's Keser and there's Chochma. So I'm summing up what the last thing we learned yesterday, and also going to sum up what we're going to learn, what we follow. As I said, I'm probably going to do more of a summary. I'll read it, but I'll do it more in I'm going to explain it now, and then we'll read it quickly. So the words Keser and Chochma are just words. They're cryptic unless you know what they mean. Literally, Keser means crown, Chochma means wisdom. But what does it mean in the deeper, like, spiritual level? So Keser, we identify with the word ayin. Say Chochma ma'ayin timotze. Chochma, one of the applications is Chochma comes from ayin, the ayin of Keser. Simply put, when an idea, a conscious idea falls into your mind, the first thing is, where did it come from? Can you trace its root? And we know we can't. That's why we say sometimes, koyach ma, what was that? Where did that idea come from? In the language of Kabbalah and Chassidus, it came from Keser. Keser is a supraconscious, what some people like to call the collective unconscious, or collective. You could think of it like a reservoir, a hidden reservoir that God created within the human being. It's a faculty from which all seichel will come. You may hear the expression sometimes, koyach hamaskil, the power to conceive. So it's like koyach hariyah, the power to see. Sight is the actual conscious process of seeing something. But the koyach hariyah precedes sight. Even when your eyes are closed, even when you're asleep, there's still a koyach hariyah, a faculty called riyah. You have an optic nerve. You have not just the keli of the eye, you also have the power of vision in the brain, in the mind, in the faculties of the soul. But then there's the revealed, again, like etzem, if you wish. I don't want to call it etzem koyach hariyah, the core power to see. And then there's the actual seeing. Same thing with intelligence. Conscious intelligence is seichel hagoli. We'll call it chochma gluya. Superconscious intelligence is what we call an ayin, the ayin of Keser, is sometimes called koyach hamaskil, is one name for it. Chochma stima, and that itself has levels. Chochma stima, literally stima means closed up. In contrast to chochma gluya, conscious wisdom, you have superconscious wisdom. The superconscious we don't see directly. We just can extrapolate and say, if I have conscious wisdom, it came from somewhere. So behind the curtain, would be the ayin of Keser, which is Chochmas Tima. Now, the level of Chochmas Tima, as I said, is a little complicated. We're going to learn about it more shortly. But there's Chochmas Tima and Arich, there's Chochmas Tima and Atik, because remember, Arich and Atik are two levels in the supraconscious of Keser, and they both have 10 spheres in them. So there's a Chochma of Atik and there's a Chochma of Arich, but they're both Chochmas Tima. Sometimes we talk about two levels of Chochmas Tima in Arich itself. One stima is only concealed from us, but not fundamentally concealed. Then there's stima be'etzem, sasum be'etzem, fundamentally concealed. Bottom line is, there are many levels of this process. Now, can we access the supraconscious? I don't mean the process of just an idea falling in your mind. That happens all the time. You have, let's say, you're walking down the street, you're learning something, whatever, you have an idea, a flash, the nakuda of chachma, spark of chachma. So that comes from the supraconscious. The question is, can you actively, is there a process, a method for us to actually reach deeper into the supraconscious and draw from it? And the answer is yes. In Samach Vav, he explains two ways that we reach there. One is through Yegiya, that we're going to learn here, through effort. When a person struggles with a question, or they can't understand something and they work hard at it, that exertion is compared to the striking of a flintstone. So a hot coal, for example, all you need to do is fan it to elicit the fire. But from a flintstone, you have to strike it. You strike it and sparks will fly. Like an axe, like an iron, a metal that you strike on a rock and the sparks fly from it. So what's the point? The point being is that it takes effort. That effort digs deeper into the stone, or in this case, into the koyach hamaskil or the chochmas tima, and it draws from there. The second thing here, he doesn't discuss it as much. A little he did with Mesiras Nefesh, is Kabbalah soil. When a person was simply with going beyond their logical, their logical and rational tools, they go with Kabbalah soil. They really want to learn Torah because Hashem said so. Like similar to what we learned earlier about Mesiras Nefesh, with a devotion that he brought from Samach Vov on the previous page. The aim of God, a person, because they really want to understand God. If you love God so much, you want to understand Him. So you want to understand His Torah. So that Kabbalah Sel also has the power to go deeper than. So a person who likes Seichel will learn and study, and that will motivate them. But Kabbalah Sel will push you even further. I don't want to go so much into elaborating on that. Just wanted to point out. So what do you see from this? That when you're using your Seichel in a regular way, in a routine way, yes, of course your access, ideas come to you. But when you exert yourself, and here in the case of Talmud, we know it's an exertion because it's coming to overcome lack of clarity. Machshakim, we're in a state of darkness, in a state where it's not clear what the Mishnah is saying. That effort reaches like deeper into the Flintstone example, into the Etzem Koyach HaChochma in Keser, in Ayin. And therefore it draws more from out. Now, what we know from this is that there are different ways of how superconscious and conscious interact. So essentially you could say when the Bali HaMishnah, the Tanoim were learning Mishnah, they had a clarity. Obviously they also had Yegiya B'Teira, they struggled and they exerted themselves, but it wasn't quite like the Amoraim who literally did not have the clarity they needed. So all this is coming to tell us of how we reach deeper into the Etzem Koyach HaChochma, which is why Gemara plays such a big role, like he said earlier. Now, the last thing we learned was, he said, either it's coming from Ayin the Keser Mamish, so that the Helen, I'm looking at the third line on page 1381. Or it's taking Chochma and it's encompassing it into the source of Chochma. So what's the difference between these two? So I explained it briefly yesterday. Let me just elaborate a bit more. Because there's so many levels, and the way God made it was in order to be level step by step. So there are steps. When you, for example, say, I'll just use a simple example. You take, let's say you have the power to throw a stone. You have the power to throw 100 feet. You can throw it 100 feet. If you condition yourself and you exercise, your muscles can get more powerful, that you can end up throwing 200 feet. Where was that power before you developed it, before you cultivated it? It was there. It was potentially there, but the muscle wasn't developed, or the agility, or the whatever is necessary to get yourself being able to achieve that. Just like you can lift 100 pounds, now you can lift 200 pounds. Where was that power? We call it a koyach. In the koyach hayad, same thing with the mind. The mind has a natural amount of brain power. A child from birth, even earlier in pregnancy, a child has a certain amount of intelligence, conscious intelligence. However, through exertion, through yigiyah, we say yagaiti umatsasi. When a person studies and struggles, what they can do? They, just like the muscles of the arm, there's also the muscles of the brain. I don't mean just physical muscle. I mean the muscles of the mind that you actually can cultivate, and a person can achieve a deeper level of intelligence. Not just more knowledge, but actually understand things better. So where was that koyach before? We call it as a koyach nelam. So Chassidus explains there's koyches geluyim, back to gili, koyches hagluyim. These are the revealed faculties. Like I said, initially, you can lift up 100 pounds, you can throw a stone 100 feet. You have a certain amount of understanding in your mind. Then, because there's a koyches hanelomim, concealed koyches. What means concealed? They're not there yet in a revealed way. I don't mean not revealed, you haven't actualized it. It's not yet even developed. So you're reaching deeper now to develop those koyches. And in this, Chassidus goes on, there's koyches nalomim, koyches hiyulim, koyches atzmim, all levels in the koyach itself that you can dig deeper and deeper all the way. So, for example, you can exert yourself and reach deeper, but then to reach into the koyches atzmim, that requires a whole other level of effort. Then there's even koyches haklulim benefesh, to the point you call it nefesh nesei koyches. So there's a whole bunch of levels I just enumerated. Here's not the place to go through all these levels. My point that I want to make is that there are levels. So you could say Chochma has a connection to what he calls here Makar HaChochma. Makar HaChochma, Chochma is like, the example would be like water coming from a fountain. The fountain is like the Makar of the Mayim, but it's a very direct Makar. You just have to access it. And the water that you get from that fountain would be the Chochma, would be the Mayim itself. But then where's the fountain come from? The fountain in turn is drawn from, let's say, springs, well springs that are deep in the ground, or other sources. So you go even deeper, and that would be called more the Ayin of Keser. That would be more Atzmi. So in the stages that Chochma receives from levels that are higher than Chochma, there are many stages. I just spelled out a few of them. Obviously, when you really break it down, it could be even more than that. But these are examples of understanding. So basically what he's saying here is when through Talmud, through the effort of overcoming the questions and the lack of clarity, machshakim meshivani, so the process of the Chachmei Talmud is because they're exerting themselves, they're digging deeper, either into the source of Chachma, like the second Oy, or into the very Ayin of Keser. And now he's going to explain the next section, some of these levels to help us understand better the process. So it's relevant to the discussion. And it's, as I said earlier, fascinating material. But ultimately, just keep in mind, the main point here is that the interface, Torah Ur, is not just illuminating light. It also pierces darkness when need be. But that will require a lot more effort and work. And when you do that, you can actually reach the Etzem Koyach HaChochma even more than Chochma Gluya, which is Mishnah itself. That's what he keeps saying, that it's higher, it reaches deeper than the Chochma Gluya of Mishnah. The words he used earlier, Now, of course, Mishnah also has a root. So it's not like Gemara is higher than Mishnah, technically speaking, because Mishnah also comes, the Ur Hagoli in Mishnah also comes from somewhere. It comes from God, ultimately, just like Mikra. But in Mishnah, it's more revealed, so you don't need to dig deeper into the essence. It's like in any situation. I remember when they were, in the early years, the Rebbe would walk for Tashlich on Rosh Hashanah, he'd walk to the botanical gardens. In 1968, I believe it was, they decided to dig a well near 770 because you need to have want to have live water. So they would go to botanical. So they dug, but they thought, I remember the machines that came, they dug and they couldn't find a well. Even though you dig deep enough down the ground, you usually find a well. And I remember talking to one of the engineers because I wanted to understand the process. He said, yes, sometimes sometimes it's so either very arid or very stony or rocky, a lot of rocks, so you have to dig deeper. In other words, the point being is that sometimes water is near the surface. Sometimes water is not so near the surface. You dig a little. And sometimes you have to dig a lot deeper. Point being is that the same idea is here. Mishnah also comes from the deepest sources. It's one Torah Achas, one Torah Achas. It's all God's Torah. However, in Mishnah, because the Tanoim have the clarity, they don't have to dig as deep. When it comes to the Amoraim, because they don't have the clarity, they have to dig deeper. So they access Etzem HaChochma, which Mishnah also comes from. But in Mishnah, as I said, the Eir is Begoli. It's like when a person has intelligence, they don't need necessarily to dig deeper. It's the student that's weaker that needs to work harder. When they work harder, they reach into a deeper place in Etzem HaChochma. Just one more point I wanted to add. So, I'm happy to take any questions if anybody wants to ask anything, because I did do more of a overview here. But then I want to go over the next section. Hopefully I could just cover that. Based on what we just learned, I'm going to explain the different levels he's going to lay out now in the next section here in Ayin Beis. But I'll stop if anybody wants to ask anything.
Thank you, Rabbi. I had a question, and it's probably a little tangential, but you said if you have Kabbalah's all, when you're studying Torah, are there levels depending on whether you just happen to get pleasure out of doing it? I mean, like, is it higher that it's harder for you, or, because you're satisfied?
Kabbalah's oil is like the military, that even when you're not in the mood, your devotion carries you over. That's what Kabbalah Sel is.
Oh,
when a person enjoys something, they don't need Kabbalah Sel. They do it because they like it. Kabbalah Sel is meaning you're learning Torah because God wants you to. You're doing it because of your devotion, your commitment. That's essentially what Kabbalah Sel in this context.
So are you then accessing a deeper level than somebody who gets
pleasure? As I said, in
pleasure?
Samach Vav, he says two ways that you
sorry.
reach people.
Yeah.
One is through exertion, yigia, effort, simply working hard and trying to understand something with questions and answers. And the second is with Kabbalah Sel, when a person does it not just as much as they enjoy doing. Because when you enjoy something, you'll do it as much as you want, and then you'll stop. Kabbalah Sel, like I said, I used the example from the military. You do it because you have to do it, and you're completely committed, so it pushes you further.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So the next section, a little dense and complex. So again, if you don't get everything I'm going to say now, we learned this close to 2 years ago when we first learned it in detail. Not only that, this spawned a whole series of classes that I did Wednesday night, separate classes. I think it was called How Consciousness is Born. 6 steps from the unconscious, from the supraconscious to the conscious. It was all based on this section in Ayin Beis. So that's what he's addressing now. It's pretty condensed. I'll try to explain it, but just keep in mind, it's all about a process from the superconscious to the conscious. He's going to quote the Pardes. Pardes is a classic magnum opus of Ramosha Cordovero, Ramak, as he's known, his acronym, Ramosha Cordovero. He was a contemporary, a little older than the Arizal. They lived in the 15th century and the 16th century in Svas. And but he's one of the greatest Kabbalists, and he wrote a book called Pardes, which is a real classic, where in a way it's considered rational Kabbalah. There's Kabbalah that's more esoteric, and more cryptic. This is more rational structure of Kabbalistic ideas. And of course, Hasidus quotes it extensively and is brought all over the Pardes. So he's going to bring from the Pardes a discussion where he speaks about how the supraconscious turns into the conscious. And as I said, I taught this already a while back, as well as a series of classes that I gave more secular language, more universal language. So if you want more on this, I definitely refer you there. I'm not going to go over everything I said then because there was hours of discussion, and especially the classes I gave. But I just refer that if you're really intrigued or interested in knowing. It's quite powerful stuff because it literally maps out superconscious and conscious connection and how from the superconscious travels into the consciousness. Yeah. So how consciousness is born.
Is this the part you said you're not gonna read inside? You're just gonna summarize, or was that?
I'm gonna read. I'll read it quickly. I'll read key lines because it requires to read this properly requires hours of explanation. That's why I did that already, and I don't feel I need to do it again because I did it then. That's why I'm giving all these disclaimers. I'm referring you there, but I don't want to skip it entirely because it is relevant, especially the focus of our learning now is understanding the interface, understanding the central theme of Ayin Beis. So it's helpful. It's very helpful to understand this process. So I will go over it. But I'm referring in case something is not clear. I'm telling you where to look. That's all I'm doing.
The Arizal and the Moshe Kodever lived together, but I understood that most of what we know today for Kabbalah comes from the Arizal. So how does Moshe Kodever's Pardes fit in? Did he know the same things? Were they talking about the same?
Everything we know from Kabbalah comes not just from the Arizal, comes from the Pardes as well, and as well as other Kabbalists.
Is it the same kind of information? Do they agree with each other?
No, there are differences. There are entire books. I've given classes on this also, the difference between the Ramak and the Arizal. There are the studies, essays written on this, comparing the two schools. There are differences. There are themes. There are doctrines that the Arizal introduced that the Ramak and the Pardes did not. Of course, they have different approaches, but it's all one Kabbalah, one Torah, but very different approaches. And in some areas, there's also different opinions about certain things.
Thank you.
Yeah. If you look in Tanya, chapter 2, he refers both to the Pardes and to the Arizal, all in one Haggadah there in chapter 2 in Tanya, for example. Okay. What you may be referring to is that, generally speaking, the Arizal is like the Posek Achron. He's considered to be the final authority on Kabbalah. So if you think about the Ramak, who's a giant of giants, compared to the Arizal, if the Arizal says something, it actually came a little after the Ramak. I mean, he was a little younger, and he lived longer. I mean, the Arizal actually eulogized the Ramak at his Levaya in Tzvas. But so there's a Posek Achron. Arizal will be considered like the final authority, just like it is with Shulchan Aruch and Halacha. But the Pardes is, I can't even describe the extent of how much Chassidus is based on the Pardes. It's a fundamental book. The Ramak also wrote other books, not just the Pardes. There's a whole series of at least I can count 10, 15, maybe 20 volumes of different works. So he says like this now. As I said, I'll read it quickly just with the focus of what I want to emphasize here. Line 4 on page 1381, the pages can be found at ayinbeis.com. That's how the Pardes works. It's by Sha'arim, gates and chapters. The whole Sfira, every Sfira, Tivchon, begimel madregas. Every Sfira is measured, essentially has 3 dimensions to it. Ukumay Sfiras HaChochma. B'chinas Aleph. The first of the 3 is Be'erech Shivya La Keser. It's the language of the Pardes. it's essentially Be'erech Shivya means like the ratio, Shivya is measure, like Shava. The Erech, its ratio in its basically value comparison to Keser. Shebebchina zu hi mekabeles u'me'ira mimena. So the first is Chochma's relationship with Keser, receives from it and is illuminated by it. Ubebchina zu hi darkusa v'ruchniyusa. This is all language of Pardish. You see, it's a unique language. And this is essentially Chochma's edelkeit, refinement and subtlety. The second level of B'chinas HaBeis or B'chinas Atzmusa, Chochma on its own, not as it compares to Keser. And then the third is going to be, I don't know if he mentions the third here. Yeah, Hagimel. Let me see. No. The third is Chochma as it relates to Bina. So in simple English, every sphere has how it relates to the sphere above it, how it relates to itself, and how it relates to the sphere beneath it. To use a simple example, think of a student. There's the student as he relates to his teacher and receives from him. There's the student on his own. And then there's the student, how he becomes a teacher to his own students. So essentially, it creates a three-way relation, a three-step relationship of everything. The truth is, and all relationships are this way. How you relate to that which is above you, how you relate to that which is below you, and how you are on your own. So why is he bringing this? Because he's trying to explain that there's Chochma, Gluya, revealed Chochma, and then there's Chochma as it's accessing or connecting with the Ayin of Keser. That's the context here. Then he goes on, now brings another Pardes, which explains this even further, and here he's going to explain 6 levels, that there's connected to 6 levels in each sphere. It's not a contradiction. There's one part that talks about the general relationship of Keser, of Chochma, of a sphere to the sphere above it and the sphere below it, and to itself. And then he breaks it down in another place in 6 levels. So the 6 levels, if I recall correctly, I actually wrote them out and spelled them out in this class when we learned it the first time. Let me just see if I still have my note from that. I think I do. I have it somewhere. Let me see if I can find it. Regardless, I'll go through it here.
Mm-hmm.
I probably have it. I probably have it somewhere written out. Excuse me, you want to say something?
I was just going to ask Rabbi, are the 3 levels like Yehuda Ilah, Yehuda Tata, and beyond? Is that where he's going with this? You don't know.
No, not at all. No, I do know. He's not going there.
Oh, okay.
There's nothing to do with it.
Okay, thank you.
I mean, he could always connect things, but it's not where he's going here at all. Here he's going simply the relationship of intelligence, consciousness with supraconsciousness. That's where he's going here. So now he says like this. Again, I'm going to do it quickly, try to sum it up. He says, okay. Benira, this is the Rebbe Rashab explaining this. This connected with what he says elsewhere, that there are 6 levels. B'chol sfira. Ubir, the sfira sa'chochma, b'chinas ha'alef, hu mitziyusa b'techa keser. The first level of Chochma is the way it exists within Keser. So think of it, how consciousness resides within supraconsciousness before it emerges. Like think of the water that I mentioned, before it becomes an actual revealed water that we can access, it's still within its source somewhere, in the ground, in the well, or wherever. So, Misyusa B'techa Keser, Habe is Giluya B'techa Keser. Second is it's being revealed within the supraconscious. It's still not a separate entity, but it's no longer just within Keser, it's also revealed. So another example would be, I gave the example of the development of a fetus in its mother's womb. So it's a very good example because there you see literally all the stages. At the moment of conception, what do you have? An egg is fertilized by seed, some magical thing happens, and a life has been conceived. However, what form does it take? At that point, the earliest stage, I think, still remains somewhat mysterious. They don't have it figured out exactly. But at some point, a living cell has developed. One cell. It will take 18 hours for that cell to split. Then the cell will split, then it will split again and again. It'll be 2, 4, 6, 8. And ultimately, listen to this. Ultimately, a human being has between 35 trillion and 75 trillion cells. I know it's a big discrepancy, but that's the numbers that, if you look it up. Trillion, all from one cell. What do you see from that? That in the process of development of anything, that's how it works. So if you think about it, it's a lot more than 6 levels. The Pardes explains it in 6 stages. 6 stages of how first it's encompassed within its source, meaning before the cell is split, where's the second cell coming from? It's coming from the first cell. Everything is concentrated in one cell, in a very concentrated way. Everything, your whole being, you and I, with all our complexities, everything that we discovered during therapy or without therapy, all is encompassed in that one cell. I'm not talking about things that happen later in life, obviously, things we acquire and life experiences. I'm talking about the fundamental biological structure. And then it splits. So the 6 levels he's talking about here is general steps. One is called Chochma within Keser. Then the Gilua b'techa Keser. It begins to be revealed within Keser. It's still within its original source. And remember, all these stages, by the way, are the 9 months and the child is still in the mother's womb. We're not even talking about a child leaving its mother's womb. It's all encompassed within a life entity. It's encompassed in the mother, in an entity. It's not yet an independent entity. Hagimel, Gilua b'mkema ha'atzmi. The third is a Gilua b'mkema ha'atzmi. I'm not going to go into all the details because, as I said, I rely on what we learned back then or the classes I gave on this topic. And I'm going to skip the parentheses because it's a very complex one, but I definitely discussed it then. Here he connects it to the level of Moiches Timah that I mentioned, or Chochmas Timah, Chochma of Arich. And then he goes on to explain the 4th level and the 5th level. And then all this will then lead to Chochma as it is on its own. So his Chochma begins within, let me just see how he says here. Chochma Kli b'Keser b'Chinas Adal v'Heid Keser b'Chol b'Chinas. Yeah. And the parentheses basically goes through a little more details of when we say that Chochma is encompassed in Keser. So there's the 6 levels within Keser, and the lower levels, as they are within Keser, become the higher levels within Chochma, because again, the spheres relate to each other. So as they develop, they also develop in their relationship. So basically, you could say the lower levels of a higher sphere will become connected to the higher levels of the lower sphere. That's essentially what he's addressing here. Bottom line is that the supraconscious and the conscious are not just 2 separate entities, not just 2 entities, they get closer to each other. So there's the level of, you can call Chochma within Keser, there's the level of Keser within Chochma. And within itself, there are different levels. That's what he essentially addresses here. That's what I'm summing up. Then he continues and says, V'gili ha'chochma memekera, v'gili shabai de'at simtsum. So once Chochma does emerge from its source in Keser, that's through its simtsum. That's Chochma ma'ayin. Chochma comes from ayin. Shenimtzaz b'chinas yesh memekera sheb'chinas ayin. Means Chochma is like a yesh. Again, let's go back to the fetus. Initially, that one cell is very, very subtle, very sublime, very ethereal. But as the cells begin to develop, you go to the 2nd trimester, 3rd trimester, you start seeing the development of a child. You actually see the limbs and the organs and the shape emerging. It was all in a state earlier. It was all encompassed earlier in the cellular structure before it developed that way. So basically, the earlier stages would be called ayin, the later stages would be called yesh. In general, he's saying Chochma being born from Keser, consciousness being born from supraconscious, is like the yesh of Chochma, the Nakuda, even though it's a Nakuda. And compared to Bina, Chochma itself is like an ayin, because it's only a spark, and Bina is a full develop. But everything here is relative. And as such, being relative, this is the process of how it goes from yesh to ayin. Again, I'm skipping some lines here, because it's, again, going to be very complicated. And then he continues to speak about how Chochmah itself develops stage by stage. First, it just begins as a very, very abstract spark, and then that itself begins to take on shape, until it actually becomes a seichel prati, not just in general intelligence, but a specific idea that Chochmah has conceived. Okay, Chochmah Mayan, Ubchinas Atzmusa, yeah. Then from Chochmah will come the midas of Chochmah, like we learned with Mishnah, that comes out of Chochmah. So you have Mishnah is the Gilui of Chochmah, but Talmud, as we're going to learn shortly, reaches into the etzem of Chochmah as it is connected to Keser in its root. That's the main thing we want to know. Okay, then the final piece he talks about is how this is by a person who, for example, is able to relate to the Nekuda of Chochmah like Mishnah and has clarity. So even though other people may not be able to see that clarity, like we know, the next generation Talmud does not have that clarity. That clarity, he's saying, is like a Chacham Gadol who, in a concentrated way, one word, and he understands the whole idea. And he could say it like we learned earlier about Rabbeinu HaKadosh in the Mishnah in a few words, and it captures the entire idea. And that's the Mishnah. V'zeh inyan ha-Mishnah. So I'm reading now the last five lines of this paragraph at the bottom of the page. Mishnah she'b'chinas gili era chochma sheba b'chinas chochma beruda. It's clear, concise, but very brief, very condensed. Talmud. Then comes Talmud, where you don't have that clarity. Shemavarer umelabenes ha-Mishnah lahetzi era emes al yedei hatam v'seichel. Talmud is the next generation where they don't have this clarity. Since they don't have the clarity, they have to struggle with it. And they have to deliberate and study and exert, like he says, to draw out the emes through a logical process. Through debates and discussions with questions and contradictions. That's all helen v'cheshach. Shazor b'chinas helen v'cheshach. Well, the Tar is called dover be'emek ha'chochma v'aseichel, and to answer and reconcile every matter with a depth of intelligence and wisdom and intelligence, to the point that you actually arrive to the truth, like the clarity that Bina, through the deliberation, the discovery of Bina and its deliberate effort of trying to and in-depth analysis, reaches that level of emes begilui. When they do that, they've dug deeper into the well, so to speak, and reached deeper places, as it is in its source that's higher than Gili. So that sums up essentially the process, what Talmud does, the effort that Mishnah itself has a begili for those that are on that level. But Talmud goes deeper into that level. Now, he's going to explain this further in the next paragraph, but I'm going to stop here. Any questions? Again, if you want more information on everything, what I just summed up here, just go back, find the classes that I gave on this a while back, as well as I've given a series of classes on the whole process from the superconscious to the conscious. Okay, we'll stop here at the end of the paragraph, page 1381 at the bottom. No questions? Okay.